Welcome. Thank you for watching today's program, Corporate Political Responsibility, a concept for today's political times. I'm Dominique Lukey, and it's a pleasure to greet you. In today's contentious political environment, any company or organization can find themselves in a tight spot for their stated positions or political spending. These stated values and priorities can be at odds with those of their employees, their customers, and their political leaders. For many, this feels like a no-win situation. Today's program explores an encouraging alternative, corporate political responsibility. It proposes a nonpartisan approach to encourage companies and organizations to weigh whether and how to engage in civic and political affairs. The program is moderated by the director of the D.B. Reinhardt Institute for Ethics and Leadership, Richard Kite, and there will be time allotted for questions from the audience. A big thank you to our program sponsors, Dave and Barb Scogan, Festival Foods, Joe and Pat Heim, Ann Bryce and Bill Haviland, Tom Houlihan, Suzanne Young, and Leader Ethics. Our program hosts are the La Crosse Tribune, the Winona Daily News, the Chippewa Herald, the La Crosse Area League of Women Voters, and Leader Ethics. And now I'd like to turn the program over to our moderator, Richard Kite.
Thank you, Dominique. It's a pleasure to be here, and thank you for all of you who are attending via Zoom. This is such an important topic. We know that politics is very contentious. It's hard to navigate all the landmines that are out there. Here at Leader Ethics, we're really concerned with general questions about how do we navigate the current political landscape and do it both constructively and ethically. And I'm really excited to learn from our two panelists today. At the end of the remarks by our panelists, we'll have some time for audience questions. And so at any point that you have questions for our panelists, just type them into the chat function. I'd want to remind you that if you're viewing this program, your mics will be muted, so you don't have to worry about speaking, but just enter your questions into the chat function. I'll be able to read them, and then I'll select some questions, and we'll get through as many as we have time for in the last 15 minutes of the program. So our two panelists today are, first of all, Elizabeth Doty, who's the director of the Erb Institute's Corporate Political Responsibility Task Force at the University of Michigan. For 30 years, she has helped leading companies implement their business strategies, improve employee engagement, and retain customers by aligning cross-functions and delivering on their commitments. Since 2012, Elizabeth has focused on the business role in addressing larger societal challenges and strengthening trust in civic institutions. Austin Ramirez is president and CEO of Husco International. Austin holds a BS in systems engineering from the University of Virginia and an MBA from Stanford University, where he was an R.J. Miller Scholar and a Goldman Sachs Fellow. Austin is co-founder of Democracy Found, a Wisconsin-based initiative committed to revitalizing democracy. So Elizabeth, I'd like to begin with you. Could you tell us a bit about your work and some of the main themes that you've been addressing through the Erb Institute?
Yeah, thank you very much. And thank you, Richard. And I agree, what a timely topic. Can you hear me okay through the mic is set up? Great.
Yes, absolutely.
And what's interesting is some of the research I know with Austin's program, Democracy Found. I was inspired by a 2012 book, Republic Lost, by Lawrence Lessig. And the depiction there was we were losing faith in our institutions to represent us. And it was leading to ever more desperate, unilateral, disconnected efforts to regain institutions that voters thought represented them. And so in 2020, I did a few things in between. I reached out to the Erb Institute, where the faculty director had come up with this idea of corporate political responsibility as something that activists and advocates should be concerned about, of how companies use their political spending, how they lobbied, where they spoke out on issues, how they spoke with their employees. And I said, I think this is something companies need to think about internally as well. And I had, my whole career prior to that was, how do you align across functions and how do you weigh really complex trade-offs? So we worked together and engaged 13 senior executives, picture heads of government affairs, heads of board governance, head of sustainability in automotive, accounting. IBM was one of the companies that was willing to go public with their membership. So we had tech, insurance, food, dairy products, etc. And for a year and a few months, they met monthly to try and make sense of what is this contentiousness at a national level and in the states where they operated, because everyone operated in different states. I'll point out one of our members who has been really instrumental in the thinking is a woman named Maureen Klein, who's the head of sustainability and public affairs for Pirelli Tire, which is based in Rome, Georgia, which is Marjorie Taylor Greene's district. So you can picture an Italian company being something that would be, that would be suspicious, and they would be concerned about imposing a political agenda. And she really had to demonstrate a commitment to using their political influence responsibly in that area. And so we've been working on this since then. A couple of things have come out of this. One is every company's issues are different, and the issues change day to day. It's a roller coaster. Chris Padilla at IBM says this is a growth industry, but we're seeing that as trust goes, so goes the world. And we are currently at a stage in what they describe in societal conflict of lose-lose dysfunctional conflict. We've gotten to the point where we would rather see the other side lose than get what we want. And I think this is something that business people, those who lead organizations, can tell where that's going. You have something to offer. You know about turnarounds. You know about organizations where infighting blocks the real work of competition in the marketplace. And so I think businesses and other organizations in Wisconsin have an incredible role to play to say, hey, there's something better here. We can get out of the no-win situation. The second thing that came out of the task force so far is the idea that you do need to be proactive and prepared. It might seem easier to stay out. It might seem possible, but everything we're seeing is both you have a stake in reversing this dysfunctional conflict at the state level, at the local level, at the national level, international level now. You have a stake. You're unlikely to be able to avoid being called out. Organizations are really attractive targets, and everything is becoming political. In fact, the pattern in societies with dysfunctional conflict is to attack the center and make it so you really have to pick a side and choose which faction. There's so much pressure to do that. And then lastly, you have skills to offer and insights to offer. So the members of the task force, and I would invite all of you to think about what can we do creatively to represent a third side, to go deeper rather than louder in this dysfunctional environment of conflict. And that's the last thing we came up with was, can we have a principled response to this, to operationalize this idea of corporate political responsibility, that you're not reacting, you're not pandering, you're not driving an agenda, but you are thinking judiciously about whether and how to get involved. You have a principled approach, can do it with respect, you can articulate your reasoning, and you can change course when new facts come to light. And what that makes it possible to do is to engage in processes that are more constructive, where it's back and forth. And you can be more creative. You're not doing big, loud statements that antagonize. So I'm happy to share some examples of that. But that's what we've come up with so far. And we've had 5 companies sign on publicly, and we think that this is something that could be beneficial to many other companies at a state and local level as well, to just clarify how you will use your political influence responsibly. And then we've had countless companies using these principles privately to help them articulate the rationale for decisions with employees, investors, customers, other stakeholders, even elected officials. So hopefully that's enough of a start, and then I'll turn it back to you, Richard.
Okay, thank you. And I want to follow up because we want to get into what those principles are so we have a better idea of exactly when companies are signing up for this, what are they signing up for? But before we do that, let's let's go to you, Austin. Tell us about yourself, your organization, and how you're engaged in this topic of corporate political responsibility.
Great, thank you. Yeah, just as a bit of background, I've been a manufacturing leader for a couple of decades in Wisconsin. And in 2016, I got the opportunity to take a sabbatical for 1 year and work in the White House on what's called the National Economic Council in the White House. So I spent 6 months working for President Obama and 6 months working for President Trump. And it was a transformative experience for me. And I walked away from that year in DC cynical about a lot of things, hopeful about some things, but really sure that if we wanted to have more functional politics, we needed to fix the incentive system that our politicians operate in. So for me, that meant coming back and co-founding with Catherine Gale, Democracy Found, which is focused on changing the way we hold our elections and moving to single ballot top 5 primaries together with ranked choice voting in the general elections. And I know that's not the topic for today, but that's what really, that work, recognizing that aligning incentives that rewards functional politics, it was really a critical part of fixing the dysfunction and what's happening in Washington, D.C. today is what led me to this work. And I think this topic of how do companies engage in the political process is really important. I think Elizabeth and the Erb Institute have done some great work thinking systematically about how companies can have a framework for approaching what are some really difficult issues. And I guess my 2 cents on this topic would be the best, there's been some research that business leaders are a relatively trusted voice in the American people. And I think the reason for that is we can talk about specific issues with some credibility. So for me, I can weigh in with credibility on issues like taxes and trade policy and regulation, and be a credible voice. I can advocate for our company. It's nonpartisan. And I think that's an effective way to engage in political discourse. Where it gets really difficult, and I think can be unwise for companies to engage, is on partisan issues that are not related to their core business. So, for me, talking about guns or abortion or other things like that, I would tread very lightly engaging on those topics as a company doesn't have any direct, direct relationship with those sorts of issues. And I think the third bucket of issues that's maybe a little trickier is what I would call some of the foundational democracy topics. So things like, we want a peaceful transition of power. We want people to go out and vote and express their political preferences. Those I think are good things for companies to engage in. And the trick is just, whenever you're engaging in political speech, being respectful, being cognizant that on a lot of topics, even when you think you're being reasonable and pragmatic, there are people that have very closely held sincere beliefs that are different than yours. And so, being careful and respectful is a really important philosophy to bring to any of these topics.
Thank you.
And I'll stop there and we can talk about specific issues or answer specific questions.
That's great. Thank you, Austin. We want to come back to you in a minute and ask you specifically about what some Wisconsin companies are doing that you've worked with that you think are really exemplary in this regard, and maybe some warnings too, some areas where you see that there's been some difficulties. But first, I want to go back to what Elizabeth was saying about this principled approach to corporate responsibility. And you said that the Erb Institute has formulated some principles. Could you tell us more about what they are so that we know when companies are signing up, and you say that some have signed on publicly, some are using your principles privately, but what is it? What is that approach that they're using?
Yeah, thank you very much. And Austin, it just speaks so clearly to the buckets that you just described. So we wrestled, and the task force members represented many different political philosophies and backgrounds and experience, and a lot of debate. And one of the main things that came up was, I'm not elected. And if we think about people's concerns and listen to concerns about the political process right now, it's very funny. Businesses are trusted. Business is more trusted, especially my employer is more trusted than other institutions. But at the same time, people don't trust government because they know special interests have a loud voice, right? So at the same time, they will point to some businesses as having too much influence. So we went through what are the possible concerns and what would be a reasonable approach. And I'm so pleased that they actually were called boring, because we didn't know if we could find common ground. And then we did a survey with citizen data, and we found a lot of common ground around what are considered legitimate basis for businesses to engage. So here they are, the 4 principles. The first, you won't be surprised, is transparency. Although we came up with some insights about why transparency is important when we looked across the political spectrum. So that fits with leader ethics core values. And in order to enable trust, but also choice, companies need to provide transparency into how they're using other people's resources, where they're weighing in, and not all of this is required, right? You can lobby without saying exactly what your position is or your priorities. And the most responsible companies will proactively say, here's why we're weighing in. That idea of respect. This is the rationale for us weighing in on this issue, and here's why we believe the position we've taken is responsible for the long term in pro-competition and our ability to deliver value. The second one is accountability. This one's not too much of a surprise. Many people, when they do distrust a company or when a scandal happens or employees are alarmed, elected officials are alarmed, it's about a company contradicting itself. So the second principle would be accountability. And that's basically the idea that you have processes for ensuring you're not speaking out of both sides of your mouth. And all of you know that is not easy. In fact, one of the main things we do in the task force is companies are sharing the processes they use not to over control all of their units, but to make sure they stay in sync around what issues they prioritize and what positions they take. What candidates they support if they do any political spending, and what criteria they use. The third one, which came from our faculty director and then a good number of the folks involved, and it speaks to the what enables the incentives that enable functional government, is responsibility. How are you impacting the systems that the rest of us depend on? And this includes, what is your impact in supporting constitutional democracy, a democratic republic, especially when it's under threat. And the idea that you might be the one, maybe in conjunction with faith groups, military groups, et cetera, saying we need to uphold the rule of law in a nonpartisan, process-oriented way, non-antagonistic, but just simply standing strong for those. And ensure that the market is competitive and that you're not using your political influence to undermine free markets, which is a source of concern for many, that you would be using it to get favors, right? We hear lots of accusations of cronyism. Everybody's lobbying is someone else's cronyism. And the idea that your influence would be in favor of market incentives that reward value. Both of these are common areas where business can help the systems work better, help ensure we have a dynamic economy that grows, that is using markets to create opportunity, to enable social mobility, et cetera. It's a major area of concern. And businesses can help that system thrive. And they can also help ensure the economics, the civic institutions thrive and are trusted. And then finally, to this question of we're not elected, the last principle in terms of what we came up with, but it's the first principle our members and companies are using, is do we have a legitimate basis for weighing in on this issue? And this one draws a big distinction between individual executives' positions and a company's position, and not thinking that because you're a CEO that you speak for the whole company. We know companies that have gotten in trouble with that, that you are not coercing people around their political expression through how you use things in the company. But then even more than this, that you pause and you think through on what basis am I engaging? And on this one, there are 3 critical criteria we came up with. One is, have we committed to this? And this is directly related to the credibility question Austin raised. Is this related to my business? Is this something that we have committed to? IBM in this one, a great example, discontinued some facial recognition software due to concerns and evidence that it was the source of a lot of issues in policing, unjust policing. And then they called for a public process to determine how facial recognition software should be used. So it was something they had committed to through their value on respect for the individual and that their business was involved in. The second one is contribution. Have we contributed to the problem? So you can't just say it's not in our business interest. If you're having an impact, a dairy company like Danone has come in and said, you know, methane is a consequence of how we do business, enteric methane. We have a responsibility to be involved in policy on that. And then the third one, and you don't get involved beyond these, right? That you don't replace civil society. You don't act like you're elected to represent people as opposed to their role as citizens. But there is one other area which I think is critical right now, which is if something is of such consequence, it affects the whole system that we depend on. And these are those foundational democracy issues. Depending on your conscience and your company, it may be human rights issues, natural systems. But this is where, in our surveys, both Republican, conservative leaning, Democrat, progressive, all agreed this was where companies actually had a proactive responsibility to have a legitimate basis to get involved where there's something of consequence to the whole system. But you don't do it for your own gain. You do it so that society can meet its interests. I'll stop there. And we will hand out these principles as we end. Richard, did you have any questions on the content there or the intent of those?
Yeah, I have lots of questions, but I'm gonna start with one. So when a company wants to use these principles, are they mainly using them internally for within their leadership team, or maybe along with all the employees to talk about how they negotiate these issues? So it's an internal facing set of principles, or are they using them externally to say, this is our public stance, these are the principles that we abide by, and this is the basis for the positions we take?
Well, we intended them, and they are so far being used both ways. And the idea would be to have an integrated, as you said at the beginning, systemic or comprehensive approach that you can apply consistently with judgment as issues come up or decisions come up. So the first step is internally, right? The first step is listening, engaging, weighing what you would do and where you will weigh in. And the idea here is not a formula, but a judgment, something to prompt the right judgment calls and help be as wise and responsible as possible. But then externally, it's really critical. We need to get away from antagonizing statements and more constructive, here's what we're for. This is this idea of a third side. And to do that, you need to articulate your reasoning. You need to articulate both why you're engaging on an issue or not engaging on an issue, which is often what companies are using them for. And you need to articulate how you came to the position you came to. And here's the twist. It's so much more credible when you do that, when you establish these as the basis you will use for dialogue and thinking before there's a crisis. And so we're seeing companies put this, say, in their proxy statement as, you know, we know it's contentious, we know there are concerns, this is what we will use, and it'll be a basis for dialogue internally and externally. That allows you to articulate your rationale and also to listen if someone disagrees and go back and forth with respect.
And finally, you mentioned that some companies are signing on publicly, others are just, you know, that they're using these privately. But it seems like from what you're saying, this idea of being very proactive, that it's really important to engage with these principles publicly, because that gives you a basis for the decisions you make, because we know there's all kinds of pressure, right? There's pressure that might come from customers, there's pressure that can come, you mentioned Pirelli Tire, just from the people who live in the region. There might be pressures also that are quite different from the employees themselves. And so you're trying to deal with these tensions. Isn't the public stance very important?
It sure is. It really is. And I think one of the challenges we have is that on first glance, you might think this is another big public statement, right? And what it actually is, a quieter, deeper, listen, we've heard you, this is what we're going to use. And it's an insurance policy to use. I know it's an industry that's big in the state. It gives you a basis for a more constructive dialogue, and that is what we need. In fact, what people are worried about is a political agenda, is capricious, arbitrary logic that you apply conveniently when something comes up. And this is a way to speak to that. And you do that through publicly stating this is what we'll use. And they are intentionally quite, they basically get the right factors on the table. You still need to have a dialogue as to what you'll prioritize when there are competing interests, as you mentioned, say from different stakeholders or short-term and long-term. So we really think this is a huge opportunity, and now is the time to say this is how we want to go forward, and we think this is a better basis for dialogue.
Well, thank you, Elizabeth. I've got a lot more questions, but I want to turn it back to Austin first. First of all, I want to ask, listening to what Elizabeth is talking about with these principles, and that are very useful for companies to be handling the various pressures they have to engage politically, and also like what she's describing as it's not really possible to have a neutral stance anymore. What are you seeing in Wisconsin? Are you seeing that companies that are handling these issues really well? And then also, like, are there any questions you have for Elizabeth? I want to have the two of you be engaged in a dialogue for a little bit here.
Yeah, well, I guess first of all, I'd say I'm not sure I agree that it's not possible to have a neutral stance. I think there's this perception that companies have to speak out on every issues, and I think that's a false perception. We choose where we're going to engage on and where we're not. And I think the core value of the Erb principles is just having a framework for how do you process these things so that you're not reacting on the seat of your pants. And usually that's when the pressure is, right? It's like something happens and you got to get something out, and so you do something just to fill the void. And I think more often than not, that's what gets you in trouble. So I think one, it's okay to say nothing. I think two, if you're going to say something, make sure you've had a process and you've thought about it. And I'd come back. Number three would be just recognize whatever you say. Likely there are going to be well-meaning people that feel very strongly differently than what you've expressed. So those people will be your customers, they'll be your employees, they'll be people you care about. So just take great care in the actual words and the way you express whatever specific issue it is that you're addressing.
Yeah, Austin, do you have any questions for Elizabeth?
Well, I think another interesting topic that Elizabeth and I talked about earlier was how do you think about the role for what's the role of an individual business leader versus the role of the company, advocating as a company versus the role of industry associations. And I think it's helpful to think differently about those three different buckets. Final five voting is an issue that I care very deeply about and I'm active on, but Husco doesn't advocate for that. And, I'm not talking to my employees about final five voting, specifically to them. And then there's other issues that, I don't advocate on personally, Husco doesn't advocate on, but that our industry associations, so for example, we're a member of the National Association of Manufacturers. I think they're a terrific association, and they take a much broader approach to advocating on a range of issues that maybe we wouldn't feel comfortable speaking out about ourselves. And that, that's a really important purpose of a association, both to, provide cover to companies so that, they can advocate on issues without having to face direct blowback, but also allow companies to, work together collectively to engage on issues that no one company can move the needle by themselves.
Can I jump in with a yes and on that? I think this is great. I think this is really important. And one of the risks, the concerns I'm seeing, and I totally agree, it's actually really important not to weigh in on every issue. I think there's often a stakeholder where you have to explain not making a public statement. And I think that's where it's hard to just not say anything. But I think that the biggest question right now, I think companies have landed on applying their values and listening to their employees as really important. In many of the companies that I'm hearing, I just spoke to a group of chief legal officers of Fortune 500 companies. And the risk there is that we're not getting at the political dysfunction, say that Catherine Gale's book addresses, that we don't get at the structural issues that are leading people into extreme positions where they can't even act on their own conscience in some cases, where policies that they would think are best. And this leads, to lose situations. So I think there's a tremendous opportunity, but it requires recognizing businesses' role in helping institutions or political incentives or the political structure work for the people and address the underlying values that we share. And this is where trade associations, there's a potential for trade associations to fulfill a collective action role around those institutions. And to say, we want government that people trust and feel represents them. We have had it at different times. These are some of the things getting in the way. It looks like, and business is bearing the cost. It's affecting us these ways. Manufacturing really has good examples right now. And so we would support a process of determining reforms that listens to citizens. That could be a great role for associations, in my view. And I don't think we get there without business weighing in on the need for correcting some really, really structural issues. I do want to add on this, a survey I just saw asked people what would most strengthen and improve our democracy, and 90% responded more trusted elections and more representative and responsive governance across the political parties. Believe that was what was most needed. So I don't know if you all agree that associations could fulfill that role.
Austin, what do you think about that? Is that a role for associations?
Yeah, again, it comes to this collective impact versus individual company impact. And I think the power of associations is that they can magnify lots of voices and be more effective, particularly on these more broad-based issues.
Is there a difference in the ways in which associations and individual companies engage in politics? Are associations more on the level of principles, foundational things? But I would think there's some companies there's pressure to engage in very particular, we might even say sometimes some very partisan issues because of their constituencies, that there might be differentiation in the kinds of customers they have, the demographics of their customers or of their employees. Does that make a difference in how associations versus companies handle politics?
Yeah, I think it is a difference. I think, gosh, you got to be so careful using political speech as like a marketing tool, either to your customers or to your employees, because maybe there's an issue that 80% of your employees feel really strongly about and 20% of your employees feel really strongly on the opposite side of the issue. I mean, I look at what happened with the Israel-Palestine conflict and, Google employees, just like if your barometer is going to be the majority of my employees or customers feel a certain way on an issue, therefore I'm going to speak on that issue. I just think that is treacherous ground to be on, because you're going to be alienating somebody. And much wiser, I think, my opinion, not to wade into those issues.
I totally agree. And the danger here, and it's very interesting when I talk to people, they have often come to the point of view that they should be able to, are you having trouble? My connection is unstable just now. Can you hear me? Okay. I'm sorry about that. That people have come to the view that they should be able to vote or weigh in on whether their company, like it's a vote, as if it were a political process internal in the company as to whether they use their political clout on an issue, that they've come to that because they've lost faith in the ability to do that as citizens. And yet this is, number one, the major source of concerns from those who are worried about corporatism. And it's impossible. Companies are not set up to do this. They're finding how much executive time goes to deciding, and how are you not coercing someone in their political expression when you haven't checked with everyone. At the same time, there are companies where it's in their DNA to weigh in on issues that have been made political. And in the environment we're in right now with the level of distrust, it may be viewed as political to argue for methane regulation to include enteric methane. And on those, the best path seems to be, what have you committed to already? What's already in your DNA? What's already the basis for your business and the value you think you need to create? The second thing to fall back on is how do markets work, and are we helping markets and competition work? But the first one is, what have you committed to? So when IBM weighs in on facial recognition software, it's something that's been in their DNA since the beginning and very active in the 50s. And other companies would have the same. Patagonia, Chick-fil-A, these are not viewed as political brands because they are acting in alignment with things they've already committed to. Think of it as Johnson & Johnson's credo. It's part of why you work there, invest there, buy there. It's already a commitment rather than voting on whether to weigh in on an issue.
So when you talk about this being part of the very company's DNA, it sounds like it's not just important for companies to sign on to these principles, it's also important to have a mission and set of values that's really clear and clearly articulated from the very beginning, that this in a way sets up the whole context for how you engage in politics or choose not to.
Yeah, I'll weigh in. I'm going to differ with Elizabeth here. I think it is the vast majority of companies don't have a mission that is in any way political. And she cited some great examples, Patagonia, Chick-fil-A, or maybe companies that have decided to make that a core part of their mission. But most business leaders are just trying to deliver a great product or a great service. And, there's no political DNA in the company culture. And, I think that's important to recognize. And I think that's an important element of this discussion, right? If you choose that you want your company to be highly charged on some political issue, like, God bless you, that's great. But most of us are just trying to, run our businesses, advocate for issues that affect us directly, and we all have a huge interest in just a stable democracy that is predictable and is going to provide stability for us into the future.
Can I ask you, Austin, what makes something political in your mind? I think that's where I'm coming from. Like the banks I've worked with now, net zero commitments are a political statement. So that's more of where I'm coming from. A company like Levi's, it would be one like you've just described, where they've said we are going to be active on guns and gun regulation. But I'm thinking like banks and net zero, or insurance companies, Climate Action 100 or something like that. What makes something political in your mind, and can it happen to you rather than you actively going out and
well, I mean, it can certainly happen to you, and I think a lot of environmental activism in particular is driven by regulation and by new SEC standards and other things that are driving companies to report differently and engage differently on that topic. So, I think that's a tricky one. Some of it's compliance, some of it is, advocacy, and some of it is political posturing.
Yeah. Yes. Thank you. And this is so difficult to untangle, and it gets to what we hope is that it gives companies a thought process, And from our most conservative members, it's really about the premises of free markets. It turns out that an awful lot of this can be covered by, don't externalize costs to society as a premise of free enterprise. So rather than saying my company is going to have a political stand, you just go to the premises of capitalism.
Yeah, and I'll go back to where we started, which I just think it's so important to have a thought process, have a framework, and the Erb principles are a great way to approach this. But if not the Erb principles, have another mechanism that you use to evaluate, what are you going to engage on, and what are you going to refrain from engaging on, and how are you going to do it in a way that's, helpful and not destructive.
So that's good. So one of the things is you want consistency, and this is, I think, early on, Elizabeth, you had said accountability. Part of that is companies get into trouble when they contradict themselves, right? So if you have a framework, whether it's the Erb principles or something else, it helps you be accountable because you're not going to contradict yourself if you've got a set of principles that you can apply on a regular basis. I want to get into some questions. I'm going to start out with the curiosity about legislators. What have you heard about how legislators are responding to this? Are they in favor of this idea of corporate political responsibility?
What we've found is that when you explain what it is, they are saying that's what I've been wanting, right? That have some humility. Don't come in here thinking that we hear comments, they hate it when a CEO comes in and thinks they're going to solve things in a day, as opposed to the groundwork they've been laying. That this actually has more constructive conversation with legislators, exchanging reasons, listening for why you're doing something. And it actually pushes companies to have a broader conversation about these foundational issues as well as their business interests, which is refreshing to the legislators that we've been hearing from some groups like Business for America that does a lot of engagement with legislators on civic engagement issues.
And Austin, what are you hearing from legislators in Wisconsin? Do you think they're on board with the need for for companies that talking openly and having some kind of framework for CPR?
Yeah, look, I don't think there's any legislator that would say they don't want to hear from their constituents, and that includes companies. I think they love it when companies can provide specific case studies or examples on issues that the legislators think are important. And they don't love it so much when you're advocating for issues that they're on the opposite side of.
Do you know some companies in Wisconsin who seem to be handling this really well?
I don't know, define handling well. Does handling well meaning avoiding backlash, or does handling well mean, really moving the needle on a policy issue that is important to the company? I got a hard time of examples either way, to be honest. I just haven't thought about that deeply. But I do think that it's important to recognize those two dimensions, right? Is your goal to avoid the downside of political engagement, or is your goal to actually affect some change that you can only affect through political action on behalf of the company?
Yeah, I think your observation there that it's hard to come up with clear examples of companies that are either moving the needle or avoiding the backlash, because we have so many examples of companies that are failing to avoid backlash. And this is one reason I think it's so interesting, the approach that the Erb Institute is doing is giving companies the opportunity for publicly stating a set of principles for how they're engaged with politics. Elizabeth, you mentioned that there's some companies that are been doing this publicly. Can you tell us a little bit about them? Is Pirelli one of them? You mentioned them at the beginning.
Yeah, and I want to speak to what you just said, is that when it works, it's quiet. All right, it's non-antagonistic. It's, here's a workable basis for us to talk. And Pirelli is one of them. And the examples I've heard from them, they have used them internally and externally. And what I've heard externally is during the concerns about ESG being a political agenda and, being forced on shareholders or employees and companies, is the focus with, we're actually working on Georgia's scrap tire problem, right? We're not doing an abstract label of ESG to be woke and signal with these performative statements. We're working on this problem of scrap tires. And it's that third angle, right? Where you're not opposing someone, you're working on something jointly, and then you get through it without the backlash. You do have the debate, there's a question of how far you go with supportive legislation on that. But it's quiet, and you don't hear a lot of noise. Same thing, IBM is another one that is very public on this. And I want to say there are a growing number of companies that have stated publicly that they will not do campaign contributions out of their corporate treasury. And IBM is one of them. Pirelli as a foreign company can't do it, but there are others. Colgate-Palmolive just issued such a policy, and it's just quiet. It's just this recognition. This is a big source of distrust. We're gonna prohibit spending out of the corporate treasury because there's not oversight for shareholders. We have Aspen Skiing, which is in Colorado, owned by the Crown family, which is on the boards of many major companies. Danone and DSM that operates in 23 states. We have a major automaker and an insurance company in the wings waiting for the next batch of companies that come out publicly. So there'll be some good examples, and they're already using them internally.
Thank you. Now we're going to turn to some questions that are coming in from our audience. And the first one is this. What are your thoughts about companies' involvement in the Israeli-Hamas war? So, and I'm going to ask that of both of you. Like, what are you seeing? Like, what about companies that take a position on this? And what are the pressure? How should business leaders be thinking about that?
So there we go to Austin first.
Oh, good. You just want to toss that one to me. No, I'm happy.
I wondered if you said that, but
no, look, there's lots of issues that I have very strong personal feelings on that we don't engage on through the vehicle of Husco or corporate, political advocacy, and this would be one of them. And that's true on a whole host of issues. So I go back to my original premise was when you talk about corporate political engagement, we really only engage corporately on issues that are directly related to the company that we can speak with credibility and legitimacy about. Any sort of international conflict that would not be one of those issues. And the question that Sarah asked about, private versus public companies, it can get a little tricky, right? Because we're, as the owner of a business, that's also the CEO. What does that mean when I'm personally advocating for something versus the company advocating for something? I mean, the line is a little bit blurry. So, it's tricky, but for sure, my point of view is as a CEO engaging through the vehicle of the company on an issue like an international conflict or an international tragedy is really a difficult thing to do. What we will do is we will raise money to support victims of whether it's a conflict like what's happening in Israel and Palestine or in Ukraine or in other areas. But that's relief, not political speech.
thank you. And I would go back to this question of a thought process. This is different for every company. And I think the first one is it related to commitments that you've already made? So I'm in the legitimacy checklist. Is this related to commitments that you have already made? If you've said we're a B Corp and we're for promoting peace and we're doing business in a way that might be having impact that is undermining peace, maybe we have to take some action. So it would be specific to your company. Second would be, is your company contributing to the challenge? This is where the Google situation really does require internal discussion. And is this something, we look at our impacts, is this something that we can do in good conscience? So it ought to prompt a really deep reflection. And the third one would be is, do you feel that this is of such consequence it could undermine the entire international order or such a human rights situation that you feel you should engage? The challenge here is whether you can have that conversation at work, whether people can be candid and authentic at work. And there are many issues, we found this with reproductive rights, that people feel they can't, that it's not a setting where you can really test people's conscience. And then that was a basis for not engaging. And this may be in the same realm. So you don't have the capability to really know the conscience of the company. So I think it's a thought process. It's so overwhelming to have to do all these, but we are on the knife's edge on a lot of issues. And so companies need a thought process they can apply. There will be another one soon, we know. There are issues after issues.
Great. Thank you. And here's another question. Sarah is interested in your thoughts on the differences between privately owned companies and public companies in terms of their ability to engage and make political statements.
Yeah, I addressed that a little bit earlier. I think the line is blurrier when it's a private company, but for me, and private companies can take a little more risk, you could argue. But even as a private company business leader, I'm very careful about what I say personally versus what Husco says.
And I would love to ask Austin why. Oh, go ahead. Did you have a follow-up? I'm sorry.
I just wanted to
can wait.
follow up with Austin. I'm just wondering if, you had talked about you're a champion of Final Five voting personally, but you don't ask Husco to do that. Is there closer alignment or less alignment between the business leaders and the business itself for private and public companies?
Well, let me Final Five voting. So that's an issue I personally care about. It's an issue that affects our business indirectly, right? So having elected leaders that are elected with an incentive system that rewards them for good government, I think is to the benefit of Husco and all companies. Even so, Husco doesn't advocate directly on the issue, but we work through the MMAC, for example, a Chamber of Commerce in Milwaukee that can represent lots of companies, and MMAC has helped advocate for Final Five voting. So there's one example. Elizabeth, you were asking, why would I draw a line between my personal advocacy and corporate advocacy on other issues? And I'm a human being, so I've got lots of my own political views that are deeply held and I'm passionate about. But it's not fair for me to use the vehicle of Husco on issues that aren't directly related to the company as a megaphone for those things. And I think it not only is it unfair, but it's not it's not wise leadership to do that, because I have employees that may have very deeply held passionate beliefs that are totally different than mine, and that's great. And I want all those people to be my employees and my customers and my suppliers and all those things. So that's why I think it's important to have a line.
I think that is not emphasized enough. And what you're pointing to, the term I've heard is compelled speech. It's as if you're speaking on someone's name, public or private, and you may have less scrutiny, you may have fewer regulations about it. But in terms of wise I love the value of responsible, looking at the impact of that in the current environment, that seems like it could be making the problem worse of distrust in government and not feeling agency in our civic processes. There's a great article, Do Managers Have a Responsibility to the Institutions of Capitalism? That really describes that people in individual roles and leaders who want the system to work have an incentive to help lead. This is the corporate statesperson idea, but that's different than using the company's voice to do that. So it does seem responsible and wise to keep that distinction in my mind.
Well, we had a question that came in directly about the issue of Final Five voting, asking, should companies be more involved in electoral reforms like Final Five voting, but maybe other electoral reforms like legislative gerrymandering or redistricting? And so, and I think, Elizabeth, you had talked about these things where there might be some issues that are really important, kind of foundational to democracy. Is that the sort of thing that you encourage companies to get involved with?
I would say if business does not speak up, and it's ideal if it's through the associations, this is one way democracy erodes. If people do not trust the system and most people trust their own representative, but not the rest of the country, that if business doesn't speak up saying, let's listen to people, let's do whatever it is that will help them trust their representative, that their government is representative to them, responsive to them, then you don't have it's a stabilizing force that would be missing. If associations are not doing this, I can see companies doing it with great caution. And I would think the best way to do it would be to call for a process, to call for listen to the people, have a citizens assembly, have a deliberative process, associations, please have a process, something like that, to call attention to it and help foster a decision to address a dysfunction rather than trying to carry it on their own, because you'd get led into the fray, right?
Austin?
Nothing more to add on that.
So
I do want to point out that out in the wake of the 2020 election, the business associations really consciously tried to play this role with diverse political backgrounds. What will it take to be stabilizing and speaking about institutions and transfer power? So sorry, Richard.
No, I was just going to ask Austin about what about encouraging organizations to be involved in things like Final Five voting, and what has been the response that you've seen in Wisconsin by businesses to Democracy Found?
Yeah, look, I think business leaders are mostly inherently pragmatic, and it's hard to look at Washington and say it's functioning well. So when you approach it from that perspective and offer a solution that is logical, people have been very, very open to it. And what's particularly powerful about Final Five voting is that it's nonpartisan in nature. So even if you take something like gerrymandering and redistricting, which kind of sounds on its surface nonpartisan, the reality is it will impact one party detrimentally and one party favorably in our state. Whereas Final Five voting is something that you can implement, and it doesn't change the balance of power. It's not going to make a red seat blue or a blue seat red, but hopefully it will make every representative more responsive to the needs and the wants of their constituents. So yeah, it's been a good response from business leaders, and like I said, we've had some help from different business associations, and hopefully we're making good progress.
And I want to thank both of you for your participation. This is a fascinating topic. And Elizabeth, could you tell us a little bit about what is coming up?
Yeah, and I prepared a slide just with a quick overview. So we are in an active process now with the task force members. We have new members joining. We have these companies I've mentioned in the wings applying the principles privately, looking for compadres to go public with, and it creates a peer problem-solving forum where you can come in with decisions to practice applying the Erb principles as a thought process. Every member gets a chance to work on a specific problem or project using design thinking and innovation methods that businesses are familiar with, and then give us input to tools that we're coming out with. We're starting with a CPR decision tool, will be out next month, and then a diagnostic to look for areas of risk. I would also invite those on this call and in Wisconsin with so much momentum already to consider supporting the Erb principles as a group in a quiet announcement. It doesn't need to be a big glaring thing, but just to say, you know what, we've settled on these. And I will, if there's time, I will come back to why they're different than just using your company values in important ways. And then finally, there are a couple of statements out right now that I would encourage you to consider. Leadership Now just proposed supporting the Carter principles, asking elected officials and candidates to adopt some respect for elections principles. There's also the Agora principles, the conservative principles for trust in elections, which you can recognize elected officials and candidates for supporting. And both of those are positive, nonpartisan, process-oriented work that have taken a long time to pull together. We have several upcoming workshops you can join. June 27th for an hour and 15 minutes to learn a method for a political risk assessment tailored to your company, and then workshops to follow up in more depth. July 9th is our next task force meeting with a peer roundtable, and July 30th we'll introduce this decision tool around the question of should your company get involved around averting election risk. So it's this foundational democracy work around potential electoral crises and walking through the principles to see where your company might fit, where your associations might fit. If there's time, Richard, I would love to come back to why the Erb principles go beyond your company values, but I'll leave it to you to see if there's time.
Well,
there is not time. There is not.
Yeah,
I get it.
we've run out of time, unfortunately. I need to turn it over to Lee, who's going to tell us about what's coming up next with leader ethics programs.
Well, first of all, let me thank you, Elizabeth and Austin and Richard. This has really been a very informative and engaging conversation. And I believe that as more and more companies and organizations learn about CPR and the Erb Institute, you're going to find growing interest. I'd like to talk about the next leader ethics program that's coming up on July 9th. Its title is Artificial Intelligence, Political Concerns in November 2024 and Beyond. Our featured speaker is Miles Taylor. Miles is the co-founder of an organization called The Future US. It's a nonpartisan, nonprofit organization that projects tomorrow's breakthroughs in order to help shape policy today. Miles previously was the Chief of Staff for the U.S. Department of Homeland Security, and prior to that, he was the head of Advanced Technology and Security Strategy at Google. In 2019, he was also, his book, A Warning, was listed on the New York Times bestseller list, and he was the author under the pseudonym Anonymous. I don't think you're going to want to miss this program. It should be fascinating. Again, I'd like to offer my special thank you to our speakers today and to all of you in the audience. I hope this was as informative and as useful to you as it was to us. Please have a wonderful day. Thank you.
Recording stopped.